Section 1. What even is a Family Guy ripoff? There is a specific kind of lazy Tuesday night that belongs entirely to adult animation. You know the one. The apartment is dark except for whatever glow the television is throwing across the ceiling. You have eaten something you probably should not have. Your blanket has assumed its final form and your eyes are already doing that slow, heavy thing where they close for just a second and then open again. A little less sure of themselves than they were before. And on the screen, some animated family is arguing. Someone is making a face. A joke is being set up, and you do not know, and you do not care whether this is the exact show you intended to watch, because right now it does not matter. Right now, the only thing that matters is the sound of it, the rhythm of it, the familiar, low-stakes hum of animated people getting into trouble they will have completely forgotten about by next week. That is what we are here for tonight. Adult animation has a very specific feel to it. There is a cadence to the way the jokes land, a certain looseness to the storytelling, a willingness to wander that you do not get from prestige drama or tight thriller plotting. And for a long time, that feel was essentially synonymous with one show in particular. One dysfunctional Rhode Island family. One overweight, not very smart patriarch. One talking dog with a complicated relationship with his own self-image. One evil baby who slowly became a sad baby. For years and years, if you wanted that specific energy, that exact flavor of animated absurdity, you turned on that show. And then other people noticed. Other networks noticed. Other writers' rooms looked at the ratings and the merchandise and the DVD sales and thought, quietly, that they would like a piece of that. What followed was one of the most interesting and frequently disastrous experiments in the history of television. A parade of shows, running now for more than 2 decades, each one trying in some way to capture something that the original had. Some of them were direct products of the same creator, born from the same network deal, inhabiting the same Sunday night time slot like younger siblings jostling for attention at. The dinner table. Some of them were built by writers who had worked in the same rooms, absorbed the same sensibilities, and then gone off to try the formula somewhere else. Some of them were made by people who had simply watched a lot of television and thought, this seems like the kind of thing that gets made, so let me make it. And some of them were genuinely trying to push back against it, to take that same basic structure of animated family comedy and strip out everything they thought had gone wrong, and see what was left underneath. Tonight, we are going to sit with all of them. Every single one. The ones that became beloved institutions in their own right. The ones that lasted 7 episodes before disappearing so completely that even people who watched them have trouble remembering the details. The ones that somehow survived their own cancellations and found second lives somewhere else. The ones that tried to be different and ended up proving something important about what makes this kind of show work in the first place. We are going to go through them slowly, carefully, the way you go through a long story on a quiet night when you are not in any hurry and the blanket is exactly right and the room is exactly warm enough. But first, we have to understand what we are actually talking about when we say the words Family Guy ripoff, because that phrase does a lot of heavy lifting, and it is worth unpacking before we move forward. The show that everyone is either copying or reacting against premiered on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33, which remains one of the best possible time slots any television program can inherit. It pulled in around 22 million viewers for that first episode, which is the kind of number that makes network executives fall in love with things they have only barely understood. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane, a young animator who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and done stints working on cartoons at Hanna-Barbera. He had made 2 short films before pitching the concept to Fox, and those short films featured a man and his dog, who would later, with some adjustments, become the central relationship of a show that would run for over 25 years and counting. The show that emerged from that pitch was distinctive in several very specific ways. It used what became known as the cutaway gag, a technique where a character would say something and the episode would immediately cut to an unrelated scene illustrating that thing, play the joke out, and then cut back. It had a family at its center who were dysfunctional but not completely heartless, at least in the early years. It was willing to go to places that broadcast network animation mostly avoided, making jokes about subjects that other shows considered too uncomfortable, too politically charged, or too dark. And it had a very particular rhythm to it, a rat-a-tat pace that felt like the show was always moving, always cutting to the next thing before the last thing had fully settled. When a show has those qualities and it succeeds, it attracts imitators. That is simply what success does. And over the next 20-plus years, the television landscape would fill up with shows that shared at least some of those qualities. The formula varied. Some went harder on the cutaway structure. Some took the dysfunctional family concept and transplanted it into new settings. Some borrowed the specific combination of edgy humor and underlying sweetness, or tried to, while others threw the sweetness away entirely and kept only the edge. Some were made by people who genuinely loved the original. Some were made by people who thought they could do it better. Some were made, it must be said, primarily because someone ran the numbers and decided there was money in this particular kind of show. The term ripoff is a little reductive, and we should acknowledge that up front. Because some of the shows we are going to discuss tonight became great in their own right. Some of them evolved far beyond their origins. Some of them succeeded specifically by identifying what was wrong with the thing they were supposedly imitating and fixing it. The relationship between a source and its followers is rarely as simple as the word ripoff suggests. What we are really talking about is a lineage, a family tree of shows that exist in some kind of conversation with one another, each one defined partly by what came before it and partly by the specific choices its creators made about what to keep and what to throw away. So settle in. We are going to go through them all, and we are going to do it slowly, with detail, with care. Because the story of every one of these shows is the story of people sitting in rooms trying to make something people would want to watch. And even when they failed, which was often, even when the results were spectacular in their badness, there is something worth understanding about why they tried and what happened when they did. There is also something worth noting about the relationship between this kind of show and the act of watching it late at night, which is when most people encounter this kind of content. Adult animation, the kind we are talking about tonight, has a specific relationship with late-night viewing that is different from the relationship that, say, a prestige drama or a documentary has with that same viewing window. A prestige drama demands attention, requires you to track character arcs and plot threads across episodes and seasons, asks you to care deeply about what is happening and to feel the weight of its consequences. That is not what you want at 11 at night when you are comfortable and slightly tired, and the week is either over or almost over. Adult animation in this vein offers something different. It offers the sensation of being in the company of people who are making a particular kind of noise. The rhythm of a joke being set up and paid off. The sound of voices you have heard before, doing things that feel familiar. The permission to half-watch, to drift in and out, to catch a few minutes of something and then let your eyes close and then open again to find that the world on the television. has continued without you, and everyone seems fine. There is a specific comfort in shows that reset every week, where nothing that happens this episode will have irrevocable consequences that change everything next episode. The stakes are always manageable. The disasters are always survivable. The characters are always, by the end of the 22 minutes, more or less where they started. That quality, the quality of safe, returnable chaos, is one of the most underappreciated aspects of this entire tradition of television. It is also one of the things that the more ambitious entries in this lineage have had to grapple with. How do you make a show that is good enough to justify its existence beyond pure comfort, while still maintaining the quality of comfort that makes people want to watch it at 11 on a Tuesday? That tension is at the heart of every single show we are going to discuss tonight, and the different ways different shows have resolved it, or failed to resolve it, is a significant part of what makes this story worth telling. Drop a comment below and tell me where and when you are watching this. I always love to know what time it is wherever you are and what kind of night it is outside your window. It genuinely changes how I think about who I am talking to. And if you want to hear more of this kind of thing, the subscribe button is right there and it costs exactly nothing. Now, let us begin. Section 2. The Cleveland Show, the first spin-off experiment. The most natural place to start when you are telling this particular story is with the first attempt that came directly out of the original. Not a competitor from another network, not a reaction from a different creative tradition, but a spin-off, a show grown from the same soil by the same creator, featuring a character who had been sitting in the background of the original for a decade, quietly getting less screen time. With every passing season, The Cleveland Show is the most instructive early chapter in the history of the Family Guy lineage, because it tells you something important about how these things can fail when. The conditions seem ideal for success. Cleveland Brown was introduced in the very first season of his parent show as Peter Griffin's neighbor. He was soft-spoken, measured, perpetually calm in a way that read as gentle rather than dull. And his defining character trait in those early years was that he was the one member of Peter's friend group who seemed least likely to be involved in something catastrophic. He was not the aggressive one. That was Quagmire. He was not the heroic one with the wheelchair and the tragic backstory. That was Joe. He was Cleveland, the level-headed one. The one who looked at whatever Peter had gotten himself into and reacted with something closer to resigned bemusement than genuine alarm. He had a deep, slow voice, developed by voice actor Mike Henry from a real person Henry knew. And there was a warmth to him that made him likable without making him particularly complex. When Seth MacFarlane conceived the idea of the Cleveland Show in 2007, the premise was straightforward enough. Cleveland would leave his life in Stool Bend, Virginia, where he had grown up, and reconnect with a woman named Donna Tubbs, his high school sweetheart, whom he would marry. He would take on her 2 children, Roberta and Rollo, along with his own son Cleveland Jr. from his previous marriage. And the show would follow this blended family as they navigated life in Stool Bend. The family would have a set of neighboring friends and recurring characters. There would be jokes. There would be cutaway gags, which the show kept from its parent series. There would be a studio, a network deal, and a Sunday night time slot immediately following The Simpsons and immediately preceding Family Guy, which is about as advantageous a position as any new show could hope to occupy. The Cleveland Show premiered on September 27, 2009, and it pulled in an impressive 9.3 million viewers for its debut episode. That number was real, and it was meaningful, because it suggested that the audience that had followed Cleveland from his original home was genuinely interested in seeing what happened to him when he had the spotlight to himself. The early critical reception was more cautious. The review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes recorded a 44% approval rating for the first season based on 18 critic reviews, with an average rating of around 5 out of 10. Metacritic gave the season a score of 57 out of 100. These were not terrible numbers for a new show, but they were not good ones either, and they reflected something that a meaningful number of people who watched the premiere immediately noticed. The show was very similar to Family Guy, not just in tone or format, but in structure, in the way jokes were constructed, in the rhythm of the cutaway gags, in the kind of humor it reached for. Cleveland's situation was different enough to be technically distinct, but the comedic language was nearly identical. One critic, John McWhorter writing for the New Republic, went considerably further than anyone else in describing the problem, using language that is uncomfortable to quote. Directly, but that pointed at something that several reviewers noticed in different ways. The show was, in the view of many, not just a Family Guy clone, but a clone that had not thought carefully about what made the specific characters and dynamics of the original work, and had simply transplanted the machinery into a new context without interrogating whether that context changed what the machinery meant. The Rollo Tubbs character, Cleveland's young stepson voiced by Mike Henry, was one of the few genuinely distinctive additions the show made. Rollo was witty, confident, and had a kind of precocious street-smart energy that felt different from the baby characters in the McFarlane universe. The family's neighbor Tim the Bear, a talking bear who led a relatively normal suburban life, was also noted by more generous critics as an amusing and original invention. These were real creative successes, and they pointed toward what the show might have become if it had leaned more heavily into the specific qualities that only it possessed. But the show did not lean into those qualities, at least not consistently. It kept reaching for the same well that Family Guy drank from, and every time it did, the comparison worked against it because the original was right there, airing in the same block on the same night, doing the same things with more practiced skill and a larger audience. Cleveland's very gentleness, which had made him appealing as a supporting character, became a liability when he was required to anchor his own show. He was not irresponsible in a way that was funny. He was not cruel in a way that generated conflict. He was not foolish in a way that created stakes. He was pleasant and measured, which are qualities that serve a character well in a supporting role and that can make the 22 minutes of a lead character's story feel like an awfully long time. The ratings reflected this. That opening number of 9.3 million viewers eroded over time. By season 3, the average had dropped substantially, and by the fourth and final season, viewership had fallen below 3 million per episode. Fox announced the show's cancellation on May 13, 2013, and the last episode aired on May 19th of that year, ending a run of exactly 88 episodes. The fact that it ended at exactly 88 episodes is not a coincidence. That number is the traditional benchmark for television syndication, meaning that a show with 88 episodes has enough material to be sold into daily reruns with minimal repetition. Fox had, by most accounts, allowed the show to produce its remaining fourth season episodes precisely to reach that threshold, which is a reasonably common practice and one that says something about the economics of television that is worth noting. The show was allowed to finish not because Fox believed in its future, but because the math on 88 episodes worked out better than the math on however many it had completed at the time. The show was canceled by Fox on May 13, 2013, and the last episode aired on May 19th of that year, ending a run of exactly 88 episodes. The fact that it ended at exactly 88 episodes is not a coincidence. That number is the traditional benchmark for television syndication, meaning that a show with 88 episodes has enough material to be sold into daily reruns with minimal repetition. Fox had, by most accounts, allowed the show to produce its remaining fourth season episodes precisely to reach that threshold, which is a reasonably common practice. and one that says something about the economics of television that is worth noting. The show was allowed to finish not because Fox believed in its future, but because the math on 88 episodes worked out better than the math on however many it had completed at the time. There is a particular kind of institutional sadness in that fact. A show being kept alive not because anyone believes in it, but because the archive it is building has commercial value. It is a fate that many television shows share, the limbo between genuine creative support and outright cancellation, where the show continues to produce episodes because the economics still pencil out even when the creative argument for continuation no longer does. The Cleveland show lived in that limbo for at least its final season, and you can sometimes feel that in the episodes themselves, a kind of going through the motions quality that is different from the show's better moments. After the cancellation, Cleveland Brown himself was welcomed back into the parent show's fold. In a season 12 episode titled "With Characteristic Subtlety, He's Black," Cleveland and the rest of the Brown Tubbs family returned to Rhode Island and rejoined the regular cast. This was a tidy bit of universe management, and it meant that the characters created for the Cleveland show did not simply cease to exist when the spin-off ended. Rallo and Donna and Roberta all became part of the supporting ecosystem of the original show, which was probably where they had the most potential to be interesting in the first place. Rallo in particular, with his sharp wit and confident energy, felt more at home in the original show's chaos than he ever had as part of a spin-off that was not quite sure how to use him. The lesson of the Cleveland show, if you are inclined to extract one, is something like this. Building a show around a character who was designed to be a supporting player requires a fundamental rethinking of that character, not simply a new setting. You cannot take someone whose entire function in an ensemble was to be steady and calm, and then expect that steadiness and calm to carry 22 minutes by itself. The things that made Cleveland useful in his original context were precisely the things that made him difficult to center a story around. The show needed to either change Cleveland in ways that made him capable of generating his own conflict and energy, or it needed to build such a strong surrounding ensemble that Cleveland's limitations became a feature rather than a bug. It did neither consistently enough to sustain itself. There is also something to be said about the timing. The Cleveland show arrived in 2009, which was already past the point where the original Family Guy formula was at its freshest and most exciting. The revival seasons of the original had demonstrated that the cutaway-heavy ensemble family format could work when executed at a high level. But they had also begun to show the early signs of the fatigue that would increasingly characterize the later years of the parent show. Dropping a nearly identical product into that landscape with less polished execution and a less compelling central character was always going to be a difficult proposition. The show was arriving at exactly the moment when the audience most needed something that offered a genuine alternative, and it offered almost none. That said, the Cleveland show is not unwatchable, particularly in its better moments. The relationship between Cleveland and Donna had a domestic warmth to it that the parent show was in the process of losing from its own central couple. Rallo remained a consistent source of genuine laughs. The show's willingness to address its characters' identities more directly than the parent show sometimes did was something that more thoughtful viewers noticed. And Mike Henry's commitment to the material across all of his episodes was never in question. He gave the show everything he had. The show simply did not always give him enough to work with in return. It is the nature of first attempts that they teach the most. The Cleveland show taught the people around McFarland something about the difference between a format and a vision, between a premise and a show. The format of Family Guy was reproducible, sort of. The vision that had made the original compelling in its early years was not quite as straightforward to replicate, and that was a lesson that every subsequent entry in this long list would have to learn, or fail to learn, on its own terms. Section 3. American Dad, the Accidental Better Show. The story of American Dad is, among all the stories we are going to tell tonight, probably the most ironic. Because American Dad is not really a ripoff of Family Guy in any meaningful sense. It was created by the same person, at the same time, for the same network, in the same creative universe, and it premiered on the same Sunday night block just a few months before. Family Guy came back from its 3-year cancellation. It has always been, in the minds of most casual viewers, the little brother. The other one. The one that comes on after Family Guy or before Family Guy, depending on the schedule. The one that people watch because they are already on the couch and changing the channel. Feels like a lot of effort. And it is better than Family Guy. It has been better than Family Guy for a very long time. Not in the way the original was good, not in the way those first 3 seasons felt like something genuinely new and specifically funny in a way that was hard to explain. Better in a different and perhaps more important way. Better in the way that a show that knows what it is and commits to what it is gets better as it goes, rather than slowly forgetting why it started. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, right after Super Bowl 39, which is the same premium time slot the original had used back in 1999. That first airing drew approximately 15 million viewers, which was a significant number for a brand new show. Then, Family Guy came back in May of that same year and immediately became the bigger story. The hype around the revival of the original was enormous, and American Dad was simply too new and too uncertain of itself to compete for the same kind of attention. In its early seasons, the show leaned heavily on its political premise. Stan Smith, voiced by MacFarlane himself, was a hyper-patriotic CIA agent living in Langley Falls, Virginia, with his wife Francine, their college-age daughter Haley, there. Teenage son Steve, an alien named Roger who lived in the attic, and Klaus, a German ex-East German spy whose brain had been transferred into the body of a goldfish by the CIA. The supporting cast also included Stan's CIA co-worker Jeff, who later became Haley's husband. The political satire in those early seasons was blunt in a way that the later Better Show would leave behind. Stan was so aggressively conservative, so cartoonishly committed to American exceptionalism and CIA-style thinking that the comedy was sometimes more about the caricature than the character. He was funny, but he was funny in a one-note way, and that note was the note of, "Look how right-wing this man is." The show received decent reviews, but not spectacular ones. Critics were lukewarm. Audiences who watched it mostly did so out of proximity to Family Guy, rather than out of specific enthusiasm for the Smith family. Nobody in 2005 was saying American Dad might someday be considered the better version of what MacFarlane had built. Then something happened. Quietly, and over time, the writing staff, working primarily under showrunners Matt Weitzman and later Mike Barker, figured out what the show actually was beneath all the political scaffolding. They discovered that Stan Smith was not most interesting as a conservative caricature, but as a man whose emotional intelligence had been completely arrested by his training, his worldview, and his fundamental inability to understand that other people experienced the world differently than he did. Stan was not simply wrong about politics. He was wrong about people, about relationships, about what love required, about what family meant. And the comedy of the show at its best came from the gap between his certainty and reality, which is a much richer source of material than simple ideological satire. Roger the alien became something extraordinary. The concept of an alien who had been living in a human attic and who coped with that isolation by constantly inventing new personas for himself turned out to be one of the most creatively flexible character devices in the history of animated television. Roger, could be anyone. In one episode, he would be a grifter named Ricky Spanish who was so notoriously terrible that everyone in Langley Falls recognized the name with a sharp intake of breath. In another, he would be a sweet old lady selling homemade jam. In another, he would be a mercenary, a chef, a social worker, a minor celebrity, a con artist. He was, beneath all those masks, a deeply lonely and faintly monstrous creature who needed the company of the Smith family in a way he would never directly admit. But the personas gave the writers an infinite wardrobe to dress him in, and they used it with genuine wit. Crucially, American Dad made a structural choice that fundamentally altered its creative possibilities. It largely did not use cutaway gags. Not entirely, it would occasionally deploy something that nodded in that direction, but the show was not built around them the way Family Guy was. Every episode of American Dad had to work as an actual story, which meant the writers could not fill time with disconnected jokes. They had to make the plot generate the comedy. That discipline forced the writing room to think harder about what was actually happening in an episode, to build jokes into situations rather than stapling jokes onto situations. And the result was a consistency of storytelling that Family Guy had largely abandoned by the time American Dad was hitting its stride. The show was canceled by Fox in July of 2013, which was an abrupt and surprising decision given that it was still performing reasonably well. But it was immediately picked up by the cable network TBS, which had been acquiring the rights to air Family Guy reruns and had developed an interest in the animated space. American Dad's move to TBS was treated at the time as a demotion, a show being shuffled off to cable because the broadcast network no longer had room for it. What actually happened was almost the opposite. The move to TBS gave the writers more creative freedom. The cable environment had fewer content restrictions and a different kind of relationship with its audience, and American Dad used that freedom to get weirder, more ambitious, and more consistently excellent. The seasons American Dad produced at TBS between 2014 and 2025 represents some of the best sustained writing in the history of animated television. Episodes like Faking Bad, which is an absurdist adventure story, The Adventures of Haley Smith Fisher, which restructures the show around a different character in a genuinely surprising way, and any number of Roger-centered episodes that explored the alien's loneliness and cruelty with real emotional depth, demonstrated what the show had become. It had become a show that could do anything. It could be a parody, a drama, a musical, a genre exercise, a surprisingly sincere character study, and it could be all of those things in the same episode. The characters were still recognizable as the people they had been in Season 1, but they had grown in ways that made them capable of more. The comparison to Family Guy became, over this period, increasingly pointed. Fans who had watched both shows from the beginning began noting online and in reviews that the show that had always been treated as the lesser shadow version had become something genuinely superior. Not because Family Guy had ever set the standard that American Dad was measured against, but because American Dad had found its own standard and kept meeting it. The things that Family Guy had been criticized for as its quality declined, the flanderization of characters into single dominant traits, the cutaway dependency, the loss of genuine warmth between family members, were the exact things that American Dad was doing well. Stan had not become crueler or simpler. He had become more complicated. Francine had not become colder or more detached. She had become funnier and more distinct. The family unit, despite all its dysfunction, maintained a thread of genuine love running through it that made the comedy feel like it was happening to people you cared about, rather than people you were simply being invited to mock. In April of 2025, American Dad was renewed by Fox as part of a 4-season deal that would run through the 2028 to 2029 television season, and the show returned to the networks. Sunday night lineup in February of 2026 for its 22nd season. This was, by most accounts, a genuinely emotional development for everyone who had worked on the show. The show had not only survived the cancellation that ended its run on Fox, but had thrived elsewhere for over a decade, continued to improve, and then returned home with more goodwill and creative credibility than it had left with. The show that was once dismissed as McFarlane's also-ran had, over the course of 20 years, become one of the most reliably excellent animated comedies on television. That is not a story you could have predicted in 2005, and it is not a story that happened by accident. It happened because specific people in a specific writing room made specific choices, over and over again, to take care of what they had built. The seasons American Dad produced at TBS between 2014 and 2025 represent some of the best-sustained writing in the history of animated television. Episodes like Faking Bad, which is an absurdist adventure story, The Adventures of Haley Smith Fisher, which restructures the show around a different character in a genuinely surprising way, and any number of Roger-centered episodes that explored the alien's loneliness and cruelty with real emotional depth, demonstrated what the show had become. It had become a show that could do anything. It could be a parody, a drama, a musical, a genre exercise, a surprisingly sincere character study. And it could be all of those things in the same episode. The characters were still recognizable as the people they had been in Season 1, but they had grown in ways that made them capable of more. One of the most remarkable things about American Dad in its TBS years was the way it handled the passage of time and the continuity of character without the safety net of the weekly reset. Most shows in this genre, including The Parent Show, operate on a principle of eternal stasis. The characters learn things within the context of an episode and then forget them before the next episode begins. American Dad, at least during its best periods, had a different relationship with its own history. The characters referenced things that had happened before. Their relationships evolved in ways that were consistent with what the show had previously established. Stan's growth as a father and husband, while never complete, was cumulative in a way that meant watching episodes in order gave you a richer experience than watching them at random. That is not true of every animated comedy in this space, and it matters. The comparison to Family Guy became, over this period, increasingly pointed. Fans who had watched both shows from the beginning began noting online and in reviews that the show that had always been treated as the lesser shadow version had become something genuinely superior, not because Family Guy had ever set the standard that American Dad was measured against, but because American Dad had found its own standard and kept meeting it. The things that Family Guy had been criticized for as its quality declined, the flanderization of characters into single dominant traits, the cutaway dependency, the loss of genuine warmth between family members, were the exact things that American Dad was doing well. Stan had not become crueler or simpler. He had become more complicated. Francine had not become colder or more detached. She had become funnier and more distinct. The family unit, despite all its dysfunction, maintained a thread of genuine love running through it that made the comedy feel like it was happening to people you cared about, rather than people you were simply being invited to mock. In April of 2025, American Dad was renewed by Fox as part of a 4-season deal that would run through the 2028 to 2029 television season, and the show returned to the network's Sunday night lineup in February of 2026 for its 22nd season. The premiere episode of that 22nd season was also episode 400 of the series overall, which is a staggering number for any television show, and particularly for one that was canceled once by its original network. Matt Weitzman, in an interview around the time of the premiere, said he had been laughing for 2 or 3 days when he first heard the show was going back to Fox, because it simply does not happen. You do not get canceled by a network and then go away and build something that gets you invited back 10 years later for 4 more seasons. That does not happen. And yet it happened to American Dad, which is perhaps the clearest possible evidence that quality has some role to play in the long-term survival of television shows, even in an industry where quality is rarely the primary consideration. This return to Fox was also commemorated by the show's creator and showrunner expressing genuine surprise and gratitude, which is the kind of authentic emotional response that you do not typically hear from people who are simply going through the motions of a business arrangement. Weitzman said plainly that he had no idea why Fox had taken them back after 10 years, that he had expected to land at Hulu when TBS's strategy shifted, and that the scale of the renewal had stunned him. That is the story of American Dad, a show that was consistently undervalued and consistently proved itself anyway, until the people doing the undervaluing ran out of reasons to keep looking away from what was right in front of them. That is the American Dad story. A show that looked like a ripoff at its birth and turned out to be something closer to an evolution. A show that benefited, ironically, from being overlooked, because being overlooked left it free to develop without the pressure of constantly being compared to the thing it was supposedly imitating. A show that did the hard work of storytelling rather than taking the easier path of random comedy. A show that, in the end, proved that the formula was not the point. That it never was. Section 4. Bob's Burgers, the warm rebuttal. If American Dad is the story of a show that quietly improved until it was better than its parent, Bob's Burgers is the story of a show that arrived on the same Sunday night block as a deliberate argument. Not a loud argument, not an aggressive one, a warm, patient, slightly musical argument made over the course of 15 seasons and more than 300 episodes that went something like this. It does not have to be. Mean. Lauren Bouchard created Bob's Burgers, and he is the kind of creator who thinks carefully about what he is doing and why. He had worked previously on Home Movies and Dr. Katz, Professional Therapist, shows that were funny in ways that were rooted in character rather than in shock, in the specific rhythms of how people actually spoke to each other, rather than in the mechanical construction of punchlines. When he developed Bob's Burgers, he made a set of foundational decisions that set it apart from almost everything else airing in the same time slot, on the same network. The Belcher family would actually like each other, not in a saccharine way, not in the way that resolves every conflict with a hug and a lesson, but in the fundamental way that families who are genuinely bonded by affection and shared history like each other. Bob would be a loving husband and father who was failing at his business and doing so with grace and stubbornness and good humor. Linda would be enthusiastic and warm rather than long-suffering and cold. The kids would have relationships with each other that involved genuine loyalty, not just sibling antagonism played for laughs. The show premiered on January 9, 2011 and drew an impressive 9.39 million viewers for its first episode, the highest-rated series premiere of the season and the 9th highest-rated show in the ratings for the week it aired. The early critical reception was mixed, with a Metacritic score of 54 out of 100 for the first season. But the pattern of a show starting uncertain and finding itself was by now familiar to anyone watching the Fox animation block, and Bob's Burgers did exactly that. The second season pulled strong reviews. The third season confirmed that the show had become something critics could genuinely recommend. The Emmy nominations began arriving. The cultural footprint started to expand. What Bob's Burgers discovered over those early seasons was that the specific quality it had that none of the other shows in its vicinity possessed was a genuine emotional warmth that was not in conflict with the comedy but was actually the source of it. The jokes in Bob's Burgers were frequently funny because of how much you cared about the people making them. Tina's anxious, earnest relationship with her own developing interests, delivered by Dan Mintz in a flat, almost deadpan voice that somehow conveyed tremendous sincerity, was funny because Tina was a character you were rooting for even as you were laughing at the specific way she moved through the world. Gene's exuberant, music-obsessed, unself-conscious performance of himself, voiced by Eugene Meerman, was funny because Gene was genuinely delighted by his own existence in a way. That invited the audience to share that delight. Louise's scheming and confidence and occasional genuine terror at the idea of being seen as vulnerable, voiced by Kristen Schaal with tremendous range, was funny because Louise was clearly a complicated person who was choosing to present as uncomplicated, and the gap between who she was and who she pretended to be was both the source of comedy and of genuine emotional resonance. John Benjamin and John Roberts, voicing Bob and Linda respectively, had a chemistry that felt genuinely domestic in the best sense of the word. These were two people who had been together long enough to have developed a shared language, to finish each other's thoughts and interrupt each other's stories, and still, beneath all of that comfortable familiarity, clearly liked each other an enormous amount. The restaurant itself, the burger joint that was perpetually on the edge of financial failure, was not just a setting, but a central character. The burgers of the day, displayed on the chalkboard in the background, were quietly hilarious in a way that rewarded attention. The neighborhood was full of recurring characters who had their own inner lives. Jimmy Pesto, the rival restaurateur across the street. Teddy, the handyman and loyal customer. Mr. Fischoeder, the landlord with the enigmatic history and the eye patch. These people accumulated over seasons into a world that felt genuinely lived in. The show also made a commitment to music that was unusual and that paid off in ways that critics and fans both noticed. Almost every episode contained a musical moment, sometimes a brief improvised song, sometimes a longer production number, and these moments did something that you rarely see in animated family comedies. They made the characters more real. When Bob sings to himself while cooking, or when the kids launch into some chaotic version of a pop song while on an adventure, the music does not feel like a production choice. It feels like the natural expression of people who use sound to process their world. It is a small thing, but it adds up to a texture that makes the show feel different from everything around it. Bob's Burgers has now celebrated more than 300 episodes. It has won 2 Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Animated Program and been nominated for the award 15 times. In April of 2025, it was renewed for 4 more seasons as part of the same deal that extended Family Guy and The Simpsons, meaning it will continue running through at least the 2028 to 2029 television season. Creator Lauren Bouchard has said that as long as people are telling him the show still means something to them, he wants to keep making it. That is a different kind of answer than the one you get from a show that is continuing because the economics make sense. That is a person who has been given the means to tell a story and wants to keep telling it. The show's longevity is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is the kind of longevity that does not always happen to warm, character-driven shows in the animated space. The conventional wisdom in this industry is that warmth does not travel, that sweetness does not sustain the kind of audience engagement that keeps a show alive across 15 or 16 seasons. Bob's Burgers has disproved that wisdom so consistently and so quietly that people who are not paying close attention may not have noticed how remarkable it is. The show has never had a moment of dramatic reinvention. It has never had a controversial storyline that generated outrage-driven viewership. It has never had a viral moment that sent its numbers spiking. It has simply been there, every Sunday night, being good, being warm, being funny in its particular way, and that has been enough. The show also made the Bob's Burgers movie in 2022, which is worth a note. The film arrived in theaters on May 27th of that year, which was a difficult moment for theatrical releases of all kinds, as the industry was still navigating the post-pandemic landscape. The box office was below expectations, but the reviews were warm. The film was exactly what you would expect from the show, and it was eventually made available on streaming platforms where it found the audience that it was always going to find: the people who already loved the Belchers and were happy to spend 90 minutes with them in a slightly larger format. The movie was not a blockbuster. It was exactly the right size for what it was. What Bob's Burgers represents, in the context of this particular conversation about family animated comedy and its lineage, is proof that the genre is not inherently limited by the terms in which it was established. The original show built its identity on a certain kind of irreverence, a certain willingness to be shocking, a certain pleasure in the dysfunction of its central family. Bob's Burgers looked at those qualities and asked a quiet question: what if the show were built on warmth instead? What if the comedy came from love rather than from contempt? What if the family at the center of the story was one that you actually wanted to spend time with, not because they were impressive or aspirational, but because they were trying? And failing and trying again in ways that you recognized and that made you feel, watching them, a little less alone in your own trying and failing. The answer to that question is 15 seasons and counting of one of the most reliably warm shows on television. The genre did not need to be what the original made it. Bob's Burgers proved that. The formula was not the cage that everyone assumed it was. The cage was always optional. You just had to be willing to leave it. Section 5. Alan Gregory and Dad's The Fox Failures. Not every entry in this long parade of shows belongs to the category of interesting failures or quiet successes. Some of them belong to a much simpler category. They are cautionary tales. They are the stories that get told at industry panels under the heading of what not to do. They are the shows that arrived with varying degrees of fanfare and exited with varying degrees of disgrace, and they teach their lessons primarily through the mechanics of failure rather than through anything they managed to get right. Alan Gregory and Dad's are, in different ways, two of the most instructive failures in the history of Fox animation. Alan Gregory aired in 2011 and was canceled after 7 episodes. Dad's aired in 2013 and was canceled after 1 season of 13 episodes. Both occupied time slots on the same Sunday night block that had produced The Simpsons and Family Guy. Both were produced with enough budget and enough talent to suggest that the people involved believed they were making something worthwhile. And both failed so completely that their existence is now more useful as a lesson than as entertainment. Alan Gregory was created by Jonah Hill, then one of the most commercially successful young comedic actors in Hollywood, along with his collaborators Andrew Mogul and Gerard Paul. The show followed Alan Gregory du Longpré, a 7-year-old boy voiced by Hill, who had been raised by his wealthy, egomaniacal father, Richard and Richard's partner Jeremy, a former straight man, who was still with Richard primarily because Richard's obsessive pursuit of him had simply worn down his resistance. The family's finances collapsed due to a poorly defined recession, requiring Alan Gregory to attend a public elementary school for the first time. And the bulk of the comedy was supposed to come from the collision between Alan's inflated sense of himself and the mundane reality of an ordinary school environment. The show premiered on October 30th, 2011, drawing 4.77 million viewers. By week 2, those numbers had dropped by nearly 13%. By the time the 7th episode aired in December, the show was hovering near the bottom of the network's ratings. The critical reception was almost uniformly negative. One reviewer gave the pilot a rating of 0.5 out of 5. Robert Bianca of USA Today said it was nasty and brutish and made him hate every character except Julie, who was Alan Gregory's adoptive sister and essentially the show's only character who did not behave monstrously. The show was officially canceled on January 8, 2012. Fox subsequently deleted all references to it from their website and from digital platforms. As of the writing of this script, the show is not available on any major American streaming service and has never been released on Blu-ray or DVD in the United States. It is one of the most comprehensively memory-hold shows in the history of broadcast television. The problems with Alan Gregory were numerous, but they shared a common root. The show had built its lead character as a completely unsympathetic protagonist and offered no compelling reason for the audience to spend time with him. This is a creative choice that can work when executed with enormous skill and a clear understanding of why the character's awfulness serves a narrative purpose. It did not work here because Alan Gregory's awfulness was not a character trait the show was examining or using to say something larger. It was simply the show's primary comedic mode. Alan was terrible. His father was terrible. The jokes, such as they were, came from watching terrible people be terrible, and the audience, who had not been given any stake in these people, had no reason to keep watching. The deeper issue was that the show had looked at the aspects of the Family Guy formula that were becoming increasingly problematic. The mean-spiritedness, the unsympathetic behavior, the humor that came from cruelty rather than from cleverness, and it had not identified those as problems. It had identified them as the product. It had essentially reverse-engineered the failure modes of the later seasons of the original show and built an entire series around them. Without the warmth that had made the original work in its earliest incarnation, without characters who had qualities you might want to emulate or situations you could recognize from your own life, all that was left was an unpleasant world populated by unpleasant people doing unpleasant things for no apparent reason. Fox effectively erased the show from the record after its cancellation, and Jonah Hill has rarely spoken about it publicly since. In 2024, after the show had been a distant memory for over a decade, a single episode of Alan Gregory appeared in the background of a Family Guy scene as a kind of meta-joke about terrible television. This was, in its own small way, a fitting epitaph. The show had become so thoroughly buried that its only cultural afterlife was as a punchline in the universe of the show it had briefly shared a time slot with. There is something worth examining here about the specific nature of the failure. Alan Gregory did not fail because it ran out of money, or because a key creative figure left, or because a network made a scheduling decision that killed its ratings. It failed because it was a bad show, and it was a bad show because the people making it had not asked the fundamental question that distinguishes creative work from product. Assembly, who is this for and why should they care? The show was made. It aired. People watched a few episodes and stopped watching. Networks make expensive mistakes with some regularity, but what makes Alan Gregory unusual is the completeness of its failure, the totality of the critical and commercial rejection that made Fox scrub it from their records and digital platforms as thoroughly as if it had never existed. The lesson of that totality is instructive. It is possible to make a television show so definitively wrong that the best outcome is collective amnesia. Alan Gregory achieved that. It is, in this sense, one of the most educational entries in the entire history of animated comedy. Not because of anything it did well, but because of how clearly it demonstrated the consequences of getting every significant creative decision wrong simultaneously. Dads arrived 2 years later, in 2013, and its failure was of a different variety. Created by Alex Sulkin and Wellesley Wild, who were both writers on Family Guy, the show starred Seth Green and Giovanni Ribisi as two game developers whose lives are complicated by the unexpected arrival of their respective fathers. The two fathers, played by Martin Mull and Peter Riegert, were supposed to be the source of the comedy. Elderly men who had grown up in an era of fewer social restrictions and who were now navigating a world that had moved on from them. The show immediately drew criticism before its premiere for jokes in the pilot episode that were widely characterized as racist. The episodes aired anyway. Fox had ordered 13 episodes and they burned them off over the fall 2013 season before declining to renew. The critical reception to Dads was, if anything, worse than the reception to Alan Gregory. Reviews described it as painfully unfunny, offensive without purpose, and structurally incoherent. The show did not have the specific focus or consistent comedic logic of even a mediocre Family Guy episode. It had the surface vocabulary of that kind of humor, the willingness to offend, the ensemble of male characters with particular personality types, the domestic setting, but without the internal logic that makes a comedy function. Dads aired at a time when the cultural conversation about what was and was not acceptable in comedy was becoming increasingly pointed, and a show that built its humor around racial and gender-based jokes without any evident satirical purpose was not going to survive that conversation. What is interesting about Dads in retrospect is that it was made by people who were not outsiders to the genre. Sulkin and Wild had worked on Family Guy. They understood professionally how the machine worked. What they apparently did not understand was why the machine worked when it worked, which is a different and more important kind of knowledge. You can learn the mechanics of animated comedy from sitting in a writing room and watching episodes get produced. What you cannot learn from that experience, at least not automatically, is the difference between the machinery and the vision. The machinery will produce a product. The vision is what determines whether that product is worth watching. Both Alan Gregory and Dads shared a mistake that would recur throughout the history of shows trying to occupy the same space as the original. They mistook the surface of the formula for the formula itself. They saw that the original was sometimes edgy and assumed that edginess was the point. They saw that the original had unlikable characters doing unkind things and assumed that unlikability was a feature rather than something to be balanced against warmth and heart. They missed, in both cases, the thing that made the original's early seasons work, which was that even when the characters were doing terrible things, you could feel the affection the creators had for them underneath. That affection is not a decorative element that can be added or removed without consequence. It is structural. Without it, the house falls down. The lesson of Alan Gregory and Dads is simple enough. Edgy humor is not self-sustaining. Without heart, without stakes, without characters that the audience has some reason to care about, the darkness has nowhere to go except into discomfort. And discomfort, unrelieved and unmotivated, is not comedy. It is just discomfort. Section 6. F is for Family, the gritty counter-argument. While Fox was discovering what happened when you tried to make a Family Guy-style show without the warmth, Netflix was letting a different kind of animator ask what happened when you made a show that looked like it belonged in the same genre but kept all the warmth and got rid of the random, irreverence entirely. F is for Family premiered on Netflix on December 18, 2015, and it was something genuinely unusual. It was created by comedian Bill Burr and writer Michael Price, who had spent years working on The Simpsons and brought with him an understanding of how to build animated comedy around character rather than around jokes. The show was set in 1973 and followed the Murphy family, a working-class Irish-American family living in the fictional town of Rustvale, Pennsylvania. Frank Murphy, voiced by Burr and loosely based on his own father, was a Korean War veteran who worked at an airport in a middle management position he despised, who was perpetually disappointed and perpetually struggling to transform that disappointment into the kind of forward momentum that he understood a man was supposed to provide for his family. His wife, Sue, voiced by Laura Dern, was a woman trying to find an identity beyond her domestic role in an era that was just beginning to offer her alternatives. Their eldest son, Kevin, was a teenager in the specific purgatory of being old enough to want freedom and not yet old enough to know what to do with it. Their younger son, Bill, was the quiet, gentle one who bore witness to all of this and tried to stay out of the way. Their daughter, Maureen, was a girl pushing against the limitations that a 1973 America was still trying to impose on what a girl could want. What made F is for Family immediately distinctive was that it was building its comedy out of genuine pain. Not the cartoon cruelty of a show that wanted to shock you, and not the performative dysfunction of a show that wanted to make you laugh at people who were clearly caricatures. Frank Murphy was not Peter Griffin with different clothes. He was a man whose suffering was real, whose anger came from recognizable sources, whose failings were human scale in a way that made them both funny and sad simultaneously. When Frank screamed at his family, which he did often, you laughed, but you also felt the shape of the life that had made him a person who screamed at his family, and that shape was not played for easy comedy. It was examined with the kind of honesty that only comes from someone who has thought very carefully about where anger like that comes from. The show received strong critical reviews from its earliest episodes, with the first season landing a certified fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The second season earned even stronger praise, with critics noting that the show had gotten grouchier and wiser, which was not a description you heard applied to many animated series entering their sophomore year. The show was nominated for 2 Primetime Emmy Awards over the course of its run, and it concluded its 5th and final season on November 25, 2021, with a total of 44 episodes. The decision to end after 5 seasons was made in part because Burr felt the show had said what it had to say, which is an increasingly rare kind of creative integrity in a landscape where the economics of continuation usually win out over the artistic judgment of completion. The setting was crucial to what made the show work. By placing the story in 1973, Burr and Price gave themselves access to a specific cultural moment that is close enough to the present to be recognizable but distant enough to be examined rather than simply inhabited. The jokes about the era were not nostalgic. They were not the warm, fuzzy television memory version of the 1970s that other shows had explored. They were specific, sometimes uncomfortable, often very funny observations about what it actually meant to be a working-class American in an era of economic anxiety, shifting social norms, and a cultural conversation that was getting louder and more confusing by the day. The show's era was not a backdrop. It was an argument about how the world that made Frank Murphy was also the world that Frank Murphy was being left behind by, and the comedy of that gap between who he had been trained to be and who the world now needed him to become was both the engine of the series and its central tragedy. The supporting cast was remarkable. Sam Rockwell, voicing the Murphys' neighbor Vic, brought a kind of sleepy, cocaine-addled charisma to a character who was simultaneously Frank's best friend and his worst influence and somehow his most honest mirror. Vic was not a good man in any conventional sense. He was a womanizer, a hedonist, a person who operated almost entirely according to his own appetites. But he was also, in the way that certain deeply self-aware people can be, weirdly wise about the ways in which Frank was lying to himself. Scenes between Frank and Vic had a different quality from the rest of the show, a kind of clarity that came from Vic's refusal to pretend that things were better than they were. Mo Collins as Vivian, the neighbor whose own marriage was falling apart in parallel with the Murphys' struggles, brought genuine depth to a role that could have been a simple Comic foil. The children's storylines were handled with an unusually steady hand, acknowledging that childhood in a house full of adult pain is its own specific experience, not merely a backdrop for adult drama. The show's setting in 1973 also gave it something that most animated comedies cannot access, a built-in distance from the present that allowed it to examine American life with a kind of critical perspective that would have been harder to achieve in a contemporary setting. The 1970s were a decade of particular American anxiety, the end of the post-war economic boom, the beginning of stagflation, the ongoing cultural upheaval of social movements that were reshaping who had power and who did not. The specific exhaustion of a generation that had been told what the world was supposed to be and was watching it become. Something else. Frank Murphy was the product of all of that. A man whose anger was partly his own and partly historical, and the show understood that those two kinds of anger were not separate things. They fed each other. The culture had made Frank, and Frank was now helping to make his children, and the question of whether that cycle could be interrupted was the deepest current running through. All 5 seasons, Bill Burr brought to the performance of Frank Murphy something that only a comedian with his specific background could bring. Burr had built his stand-up career on a kind of amplified masculine frustration, an ability to channel and explore the anger of men who felt that the world was changing faster than their internal emotional vocabulary could keep up with. But what his stand-up also contained, if you listened carefully, was a deep self-awareness about the limitations of that anger, an understanding that the things he was most angry about were often things he was most afraid of. Frank Murphy had both of those qualities in abundance. He was genuinely angry. He was also genuinely afraid. And the way those two things coexisted in the same character, the way one masked the other and was masked by it in turn, was the emotional engine that kept the show running. F is for Family was not a Family Guy ripoff in any meaningful sense. The two shows share the category of adult animated family comedy and almost nothing else. The humor was completely different, character-driven and earned through sustained storytelling rather than deployed through disconnected gags. The tone was completely different, naturalistic and often genuinely sad in ways that Family Guy had mostly abandoned by the time F is for Family appeared. The central relationship of the family was completely different, troubled and loving in ways that were always simultaneously true rather than the alternating coldness and warmth that characterized the Griffin household in its less careful moments. What F is for Family represents in this conversation is a demonstration that the animated family comedy format has a range that most of its practitioners had not bothered to explore. That you can take the basic ingredients of the genre, the flawed patriarch, the strained marriage, the children negotiating between the world their parents came from and the world they are growing into, and you can tell a story with them that is genuinely honest about what those dynamics feel like from the inside. That animation, far from limiting what you can say about human experience, can actually open it up if you are willing to use the form with genuine intention. Bill Burr, as recently as July 2025, mentioned on his podcast that he had been reviewing scripts for a potential 6th season, which suggests the story of the Murphy family may not be entirely finished. Whether that comes to fruition remains to be seen. But the 5 seasons that already exist are enough to secure the show's place as one of the most distinctive and serious animated comedies of its era. A show that used the architecture of its genre to say something true about American life rather than simply to arrange jokes in a sequence. Section 7. Brickleberry and Legends of Chamberlain Heights, the cable underdogs, outside the Fox animation block, outside Netflix, out in the scruffier territory of cable. Television where the budgets were smaller and the content restrictions were basically whatever the network's lawyers would sign off on, a different species of Family Guy adjacent. Show was evolving. These were the shows that took the formula's most extreme aspects and amplified them, that stripped away any pretense of heart or warmth and just went for the most outrageous version of the concept they could construct. Some of them found audiences, some of them did not. All of them occupy a specific and fascinating niche in the history of this format. Brickleberry premiered on Comedy Central on September 25, 2012, and it was the kind of show that knew exactly what it was and had precisely no interest in being anything else. Created by Waco Ogin and Roger Black, two comedy writers who had met at the University of Georgia in 1999 and had been developing the concept since 2003. The show had originally been pitched as a live-action program before being adapted for animation because of budget constraints. Fox had actually ordered a pilot in 2007, but passed on the series, finding it too offensive. Daniel Tosh, then at the height of his popularity through his Comedy Central series Tosh To, connected with the creators and put his support behind the project, eventually serving as an executive producer and voicing Malloy, the show's most anarchic character. The show followed a group of rangers at the fictional Brickleberry National Park, a second-tier national park that was perpetually on the edge of closure. Steve Williams, the show's primary protagonist, was an overconfident, deeply incompetent ranger who had been named Ranger of the Month for years without any evidence that he possessed the skills the title implied. Woody Johnson was the park director, a financially motivated bureaucrat who ran the park with minimal interest in any of its actual purposes. Ethel Anderson was the competent one, transferred to Brickleberry after being fired from Yellowstone, perpetually frustrated by the incompetence around her. Denzel Jackson was the sole black ranger at the park. Connie Kuhneman rounded out the team. And Malloy, voiced by Tosh, was the park's resident bear, a spoiled, cruel, and hilariously self-aware animal who functioned as a kind of id for the ensemble, saying the things that other characters were too polite or too stupid to say. The show ran for 3 seasons and 36 episodes before Comedy Central canceled it in January of 2015, citing declining viewership. The first season had averaged comfortably in the young male demographic that Comedy Central considered its core audience, but the numbers had declined enough by season 3, too. Make renewal difficult to justify. Critics had given the show mixed to negative reviews, with Ein noting that it did not have the underlying humanity that distinguished Comedy Central's strongest animated work. But it had a devoted cult following, who appreciated its relentless offensiveness and its commitment to a particular kind of mean, anarchic humor that made no apologies for itself. What Brickleberry was doing, at its best, was something that the animated comedy format had always been capable of, and rarely attempted with this degree of consistency it was. Depicting a world in which no one was safe, no subject was sacred, and the joke was always on everyone, including the audience. This is a legitimate comedic tradition with a long history, and when Brickleberry was clicking on all cylinders, the nihilism was coherent in its own terms. Malloy's contempt for everyone around him had a certain clarity to it. The park's persistent failure was funny in the way that systems of organized incompetence are always funny when depicted with sufficient specificity. The show had a knowing quality beneath all the outrage, an awareness that it was doing something transgressive that gave even its most uncomfortable moments a kind of wink. After Brickleberry's cancellation, Ogin and Black essentially took their cast, their voice actors, their comedic sensibility, and their basic premise, and rebuilt it on a different platform. Paradise PD premiered on Netflix on August 31, 2018, and was the most direct continuation of the Brickleberry universe outside of a formal reboot. The show followed a small-town police department in the fictional town of Paradise, and if you had watched Brickleberry, the characters were immediately recognizable as variations on the same archetypes the creators had been working with for years. Kevin Crawford was the eager, incompetent new recruit in the role that Steve had occupied at Brickleberry. Chief Randall Crawford was the blustery, self-interested authority figure. Dusty Marlowe was the enormous, slovenly officer in the role that the park's most physically extreme rangers had occupied. Gina Jabowski was the violent, unstable enforcer. The show ran for 4 seasons and 40 episodes before Netflix ended its run with a final season in December of 2022. The creators, in a video released alongside a Kickstarter campaign for a graphic novel that would serve as a concluding chapter for both Paradise PD and their subsequent series, Farzar, expressed genuine frustration at having their stories end on cliffhangers when they had planned to give them proper endings. The Kickstarter was launched in March of 2026 and reached its funding goal of $20,000 in 7 hours. The creators had a clear vision for how both stories were supposed to end, and the fact that they were pursuing that vision through a graphic novel rather than through a television platform said something about where animation on streaming services was landing as platforms became more conservative about renewing shows with smaller but devoted audiences. Legends of Chamberlain Heights aired on Comedy Central in 2016, and it deserves mention here because it represented something slightly different. Created by Brad Abelson, Michael Bowser, and Kern Carter, the show followed 3 high school friends who were convinced they were destined for basketball stardom and whose inflated sense of their own abilities drove every episode's conflict. The show was animated in a style that was more stylized and angular than the typical adult animation aesthetic, and its humor was rooted in Black youth culture in ways that gave it a voice genuinely distinct from the Fox Sunday night block. It lasted 2 seasons before Comedy Central canceled it. The show deserved better. Its supporting cast was sharp, its comedic instincts were usually sound, and its willingness to root its humor in a specific cultural context rather than the generic suburban white American milieu that dominated most adult animation gave it an identity that was hard to find elsewhere in the landscape. Its cancellation was a quiet loss that fewer people noticed than should have. Section 8. Paradise PD and Hoops, the Netflix imitators. The streaming era, which for adult animation really began to take shape in the mid-2010s and accelerated, significantly after that, created a new environment for shows in this lineage. Netflix in particular became a home for animated comedies that wanted to operate at the extreme end of the content spectrum, shows that broadcast television would not air and that cable television would not have tolerated a decade earlier. The platform's global reach and its different relationship with advertiser concerns meant that the content guardrails that had shaped broadcast animation were simply absent. And a generation of creators who had grown up watching Family Guy and its adjacent shows arrived on this new platform, ready to see how far the formula could go without any of the traditional constraints. Paradise PD was, in this context, a deliberate attempt to bring the Brickleberry sensibility to a streaming platform with more resources and fewer restrictions. It has already been discussed in the context of its creator's body of work, but it is worth pausing here to consider what it meant specifically as a Netflix property, because the platform shaped what it became in ways that are worth examining. Netflix does not publish traditional viewership numbers, which means that the metrics by which shows on traditional television live and die are simply not available for streaming. Native properties. A show can have millions of viewers and still get canceled if the platform decides, through whatever algorithm or executive judgment guides these decisions, that those millions are not the right millions or are not generating enough of whatever value the platform is currently optimizing for. Paradise PD's 4-season run ended not because the show had catastrophically low viewership, but because Netflix had decided to pull back on adult animation as a category, which was a strategic decision by the platform rather than a verdict on the show's quality. The creators were frustrated, the fans were frustrated, and the show ended without the ending its creators had planned. Hoops, on the other hand, was a Netflix animated series that premiered in August of 2020 and lasted exactly one season before the platform canceled it. Created by Ben Hoffman and starring the voice of Jake Johnson as Ben Hopkins, a high school basketball coach in rural Kentucky who is perpetually one season away from being fired, and who responds to this situation with aggression, foul language, and poor decision-making. The show was Family Guy adjacent in structure while having a different enough setting and character base to feel like its own thing. The reviews were mixed to negative, with most critics noting that the show had a capable voice cast and some genuinely funny moments, but that it never assembled those moments into a coherent enough vision to justify continued investment. Netflix declined to renew it after one season of 10 episodes. What Hoops and Paradise PD share is a particular kind of streaming-era fate that is different from the broadcast fate of shows like Alan Gregory or Dads. Those shows failed because audiences did not watch them. The Netflix cancellations are murkier because the audience data is opaque. Paradise PD had a devoted enough following to generate a funded Kickstarter for a concluding graphic novel. Hoops had defenders who felt the show had been canceled before it had a chance to find its footing. The issue with both was less about the shows themselves than about a platform's evolving priorities, which is a less satisfying story than the traditional narrative of a show, succeeding or failing on its own merits. The broader category of Netflix adult animation in this period is worth noting. The platform's relationship with animated comedy was genuinely volatile through the late 2010s and early 2020s. Shows were greenlit enthusiastically, allowed to run for 1 or 2 or 3 seasons, and then canceled based on criteria that were rarely explained clearly to the public. For every big mouth, which Netflix supported through many seasons, there were several shows that found their feet and were then canceled before they could capitalize on that. Progress. The economics of streaming had promised a golden age for animation, because streaming platforms were competing aggressively for content and animation was cheaper than live action. What actually happened was something more complicated, a burst of creative activity followed by a contraction as platforms realized that the economics of adult animation were not as favorable as they had initially appeared, particularly when the target demographic was highly specific and did not necessarily translate into the broad, global audience that streaming platforms needed to justify their content investments. The shows that survived this environment tended to have either enormous creative pedigree attached to them or a genuinely massive viewership. The shows that did not have either of those things, which included many perfectly competent and sometimes genuinely good animated comedies, found themselves canceled in ways that felt arbitrary and premature. This was not a uniquely streaming-era problem. Broadcast television had always canceled good shows too early and renewed mediocre ones too long. But the promise of streaming had been that the data-driven nature of the platform would solve this, that shows would get the seasons they deserved because the platform could. Measure exactly how many people were watching and make rational decisions accordingly. What happened instead was that the data was used in ways that remained opaque, and creators found themselves at the mercy of platform decisions they could neither predict nor influence. Paradise PD and Hoops were 2 examples of this experience. There were many others. Section 9. Solar Opposites and Disenchantment. The Prestige Alternatives. 2 shows occupy a particular position in this history that is worth examining carefully. Both are animated comedies that arrived on streaming platforms with significant creative pedigree attached to them. Both developed loyal followings and critical respect. Both ended up having their stories complicated by circumstances that had nothing to do with their quality. One of them is among the most interesting experiments in the Family Guy adjacent space. The other is a genuinely ambitious piece of world building that happened to share a network with the former. They are solar opposites in disenchantment, and together they represent something close to the high end of what the streaming era produced in this particular corner of television. Solar Opposites was created by Justin Roiland and Mike McMahon for Hulu, where it premiered on May 8, 2020. Roiland was, at the time, at the peak of his cultural visibility as the co-creator and lead voice actor on Rick and Morty, which had become one of the most talked about animated comedies of the decade. McMahon was a writer from that same world who would go on to create Star Trek Lower Decks. The premise of Solar Opposites centered on four aliens, Corvo and Terry and their two child replicants Yumulak and Jesse, who had escaped their doomed homeworld and landed in a suburban American house. Their mission was to protect Apupa, a living supercomputer that would eventually terraform Earth and destroy humanity. While Corvo and Yumulak regarded Earth with contempt, Terry and Jesse had adapted enthusiastically to human life, and particularly to human pop culture. The show was originally developed for Fox Broadcasting Company, but was shelved and subsequently bought by Hulu, where it launched to strong critical notices. Season 1 earned a 92% rating on Rotten Tomatoes based on reviews from 37 critics, with the site's consensus describing it as charming, hilarious, and surprisingly sincere. Season 2 received a 100% rating. The show was one of Hulu's most watched original comedy premieres upon its debut. Hulu renewed it rapidly, ordering a second season before the first had even aired, and the early momentum was genuinely strong. What made Solar Opposites interesting as an entry in this lineage was the way it used the Family Guy-adjacent surface language of an animated comedy about a strange household as the framework for something with more structural ambition. The show's Wall storyline, which followed a society of humans who had been shrunk down by Yumulak and imprisoned in a large terrarium in his bedroom wall, became increasingly elaborate and character-rich across seasons, eventually functioning as a fully developed drama nested inside the main show. The Wall was, in many ways, the most interesting thing Solar Opposites did, because it was doing something that the Family Guy formula had largely abandoned: sustained storytelling with characters who grew, changed, suffered, and triumphed across multiple episodes in ways that accumulated and mattered. The show's surface comedy was often very funny in the specific ways that Justin Roiland's sensibility produced, the improvisational quality of the dialogue, the specific blend of sci-fi premise and domestic absurdity, the delight in taking a concept to its most extreme logical conclusion. But it was The Wall that gave the show its depth, and it was The Wall that critics and fans consistently pointed to when explaining why they were invested in Solar Opposites. Beyond the level of it's from the guy who made Rick and Morty. Then, in early 2023, Roiland was removed from the series following domestic violence allegations against him. The circumstances were serious, and the creative consequences were significant. Starting with the fourth season, Dan Stevens took over the voice of Corvo, the character Roiland had originated. This kind of midstream recasting is always jarring, and the audience response was predictably divided. Some viewers felt the character had changed fundamentally. Others appreciated Stevens' performance on its own terms and felt the show had continued to be excellent. The critical reception to the fourth season was actually strong, with an approval rating of 100% on Rotten Tomatoes based on its reviews, which suggested that the professional assessment of the show's quality had not been affected by the casting change, even if the fan response was more complicated. The show has continued producing seasons since then, with a seventh season confirmed as of 2025. Disenchantment arrived on Netflix in August of 2018, created by Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons and Futurama. It was a fantasy animated comedy set in a medieval kingdom called Dreamland and centered on Princess Bean, her elvish companion Elfo, and her personal demon Lucci. The show had an enormous amount of creative pedigree behind it. Groening's two previous shows had between them produced some of the most celebrated animated television ever made, and the premise was genuinely fresh. A story set in a world of fantasy tropes and archetypes rather than in the suburban America that had been the default setting for animated family comedies since The Simpsons established it. The show received mixed initial reviews. Some critics found it slow to develop. Others appreciated its willingness to build a serialized story rather than relying on episodic structure. Over its 4-season run, the critical reception warmed as the show's longer narrative arcs became clearer and the central characters developed in interesting ways. Bean, in particular, became one of the more complex female protagonists in animated comedy, a princess who was resistant to every conventional role the world was trying to assign her and who was perpetually caught between the life she wanted and the obligations she had inherited. Her relationship with Elfo and Lucci had a genuine warmth to it that gave the show emotional texture beyond its comedy. Netflix canceled Disenchantment after its 4th season, which ended in 2023 on an unresolved cliffhanger, a decision that was met with significant fan frustration. Groening has spoken about his desire to provide a proper ending for the story, and there were reports of discussions about alternative ways to conclude it, though nothing concrete had materialized as of the writing of this script. The cancellation was another example of the streaming platform making a content decision that felt disconnected from the quality of what was being canceled, leaving a body of work that had been building towards something without the final chapter it needed. What Solar Opposites and Disenchantment share is an ambition that sets them apart from most of the shows in this survey. Both were trying to do something more than fill a genre slot. Both were building toward larger things, longer stories, more sustained emotional investments. Both were complicated by circumstances outside their creative control. One by a casting crisis of genuine gravity, one by a platform decision that ended the story before it was finished. Both remain, in spite of those complications, among the more interesting animated comedies of their era. They represent what the streaming platform was capable of making possible when it was willing to let shows develop on their own terms, and they represent what that promise cost when the platform decided to walk away. Section 10A, the Prestige Tier, Rick and Morty, Archer, and BoJack Horseman. Before we get to the Orville, there is another branch of this family tree that deserves its own careful examination, because alongside the shows that were directly imitating or reacting to the Family Guy formula, another set of shows was developing in the same period that took the surface vocabulary of adult animation and did something with it that nobody in the early 2000s had quite anticipated. These were shows that used the permission structure that Family Guy and South Park had established, the permission to be irreverent and dark and willing to go places that broadcast TV avoided, and then brought a level of craft, emotional complexity, and genuine ambition to that permission that changed what adult animation was considered capable of. These shows are not rip-offs. They are something closer to what happens when a musical tradition that has been operating in a particular key for a long time produces a generation of musicians who have heard everything in that key and want to know what the key is actually capable of expressing. They represent the adult animation equivalent of prestige television, using the form not to distill itself further, but to expand into territory that the form had not previously occupied. Archer began airing on FX in September of 2009 and immediately established itself as something distinct from anything that had preceded it. Created by Adam Reed, the show was a workplace comedy set in a spy agency, combining the structure of an office comedy with the content of a spy thriller in ways that were genuinely fresh. Sterling Archer, voiced by H. John Benjamin, who would also go on to voice Bob Belcher on Bob's Burgers, was a narcissist of almost total completeness. A man whose self-regard was so comprehensive that it had absorbed every other personality trait and left only the shell of a human being performing the gestures of normal social interaction while actually pursuing nothing beyond his own comfort and gratification. His colleagues at ISIS, the spy agency run by his mother Mallory, were similarly extreme in their particular dysfunctions. Cyril, the accountant, was motivated by resentment and inadequacy. Pam was socially desperate. Cheryl was eccentric to the point of genuine pathology. Lana, the most competent operative at the agency, was perpetually frustrated by everyone around her. The comedy of Archer was built entirely on character rather than on the disconnected joke structure that Family Guy had made its signature. Every episode's humor came from the specific interactions of specific people with specific histories that had been established and elaborated across multiple seasons. References built on references. Callbacks rewarded attention. The show's visual design was also unusual, using a flat, almost retro illustration style that gave it a distinctive look unlike anything else on television. The writing was extraordinarily dense, with jokes layered so thickly that repeat viewings consistently revealed things that had been too fast to catch the first time through. Archer ran for 14 seasons, which is a remarkable number for any comedy, and it sustained genuine quality across most of that run, even during the Dreamland seasons where a change in format temporarily made the show unrecognizable to casual viewers. It was exactly the kind of show that demonstrated what adult animation could be when the writer did not reach for shock as a substitute for craft. Reed's writing was always conscious of what it was doing, always building, always paying off things it had planted episodes or seasons before. The show was funny in the way that very clever, very specific writing is funny, densely, repeatedly, and with increasing rewards for attention. Rick and Morty arrived on Adult Swim in December of 2013, created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, and it became, over the following decade, one of the most culturally significant animated comedies ever made. The show followed Rick Sanchez, a genius scientist with a drinking problem and a complete contempt for the universe's meaning, and his grandson Morty, an anxious, normal teenager who had been recruited as Rick's companion and assistant on interdimensional adventures. The show's premise was deliberately derivative, openly acknowledging its debt to Back to the Future in its earliest conception. But what Harmon and Roiland did with that premise was genuinely original. Rick and Morty was interested at its deepest level in a philosophical problem that animated comedy had rarely taken seriously. What does it mean to live in a universe that is genuinely infinite, genuinely random, and genuinely indifferent to human meaning-making? Rick was a character who had absorbed the full implications of that question and had arrived at a kind of nihilism that was both funny and, if you let it, genuinely disturbing. His intelligence was real, his adventures were genuinely dangerous, and the cost they extracted from the people around him, particularly Morty, was not always presented as acceptable. The show was willing to let things matter and then to undercut the mattering, which is a difficult balance and one that it achieved with extraordinary skill during its best seasons. The show's cultural impact was enormous and strange. It accumulated a fan base that was, at its most intense, almost fervent in its engagement. It generated an extraordinary amount of online discussion, analysis, and academic attention. It inspired think pieces about nihilism and free will and the nature of existence. It also generated the famous McDonald's Szechuan sauce incident, which represents a very different kind of cultural impact and which serves as a reminder that the most Interesting art always attracts the most interesting range of responses. Rick and Morty ran into creative complications when Roiland was removed from the show following the same domestic violence allegations that had removed him from Solar Opposites. The show has continued without him, with new voice actors replacing the characters he originated, and the critical and fan response to this transition has been complex and ongoing. The show that exists without Roiland is still Rick and Morty in every structural sense. But whether it is Rick and Morty in the sense that made it significant is a question that fans will continue to argue about for years. BoJack Horseman deserves its own paragraph of attention, even though it is technically outside this particular lineage. The show aired on Netflix from 2014 to 2020 and was created by Raphael Bob Waksberg. It was an animated comedy set in a version of Hollywood where anthropomorphic animals and humans existed side by side, centered on BoJack Horseman, a washed-up sitcom star from the 1990s who was depressed, alcoholic, self-sabotaging, and genuinely desperate in ways that the show did not sentimentalize or excuse. BoJack Horseman was one of the most honest animated comedies about mental illness, addiction, and the specific way that trauma propagates through generations. And it did all of those things while also being genuinely, precisely funny in the way that shows are funny when they understand their characters completely. The reason to mention BoJack in this context is that it represents the outer limit of what the adult animated comedy tradition could reach when its practitioners were willing to be completely honest. It took the format that Family Guy had popularized, the adult animated show that does not worry about whether children are watching, and it used that freedom not primarily to be shocking or edgy, but to be emotionally true in ways that few live-action comedies were willing to be. Its final season is one of the most powerful finales in the history of animated television. Its willingness to allow its central character to fail specifically and consequentially and without redemption that canceled out the failure, was unprecedented in this genre. BoJack Horseman is the show that this entire lineage was always capable of becoming, if the people making it were willing to care that much. These shows, Archer, Rick and Morty, and BoJack Horseman, represent the point at which adult animation stopped being a genre that was defined by what it was willing to do that broadcast TV would not do, and started being a genre that was defined by what it was willing to say that other genres were not willing to say. That is a different kind of ambition, and it required a different kind of craft, and the fact that the ground for all of it was laid in part by Family Guy and its contemporaries is something worth acknowledging. The shows that pushed the form to its limits could not have done so without the shows that first established what the form was allowed to be. Section 11. The Orville, when McFarlane ran from himself. There is a show on this list that is unlike any other entry we have discussed tonight. It is not a family comedy. It does not have a dysfunctional household at its center. It does not use cutaway gags. It does not traffic in shock humor or animated violence or the specific kind of sarcastic, self-aware humor that became synonymous with the Family Guy aesthetic. And yet, it belongs in this conversation because it is, in the most direct possible sense, a show that Seth MacFarlane made when he was trying to get as far away from what had made him famous as he possibly could without leaving the medium entirely. The Orville premiered on Fox on September 10th, 2017. It was a science fiction series set in the year 2419 aboard a mid-level exploratory spaceship. The US Orville, captained by Ed Mercer, played and created by MacFarlane himself. The premise was openly and extensively inspired by the Star Trek franchise, particularly by the versions of that franchise that had aired during what many fans considered its golden period, meaning the original series and the next generation. The Orville was not a parody of Star Trek. It was a love letter to the kind of optimistic, humanistic science fiction that Star Trek had represented at its best, filtered through McFarlane's genuine passion for the genre and his understanding of what had made those shows work. This is the point where the context of this video becomes important. The Orville was made by a man who had spent nearly 20 years creating shows that operated in the territory of irreverence, of transgression, of comedic darkness, of cutaway, dependent humor that made no claims to emotional depth or sustained storytelling. And during all those years, McFarlane had been a science fiction fan. An earnest, genuine, deeply committed science fiction fan who had grown up watching Star Trek and who had never lost his affection for the specific ideals that franchise represented. The idea that the future could be better, that humanity could improve, that intelligence and compassion and curiosity were virtues worth depicting on screen. The Orville was his chance to make that show. And what is interesting in the context of this particular survey is that he did not make it as a comedy. Not primarily. There are jokes in the Orville. McFarlane's sensibility is present throughout, and it produces humor that is sometimes very funny and that feels genuinely earned rather than random. But the show's primary mode is drama. Real stakes. Real character development. Real emotional investment in the outcomes of the stories it was telling. The alien crew members of the Orville were not the basis for a series of jokes about cultural difference. They were characters whose perspectives illuminated human behavior by examining it from outside. The romantic relationships on the show had weight and consequence. The ethical dilemmas that each episode raised were taken seriously and explored with genuine rigor. The initial critical reception to the Orville was mixed in a way that reflected a genuine uncertainty about what the show was trying to be. Some critics, expecting the kind of comedy that McFarlane was known for, were confused by the earnestness. Others, expecting a parody, were surprised by the sincerity. The audience response was stronger and more consistent from the beginning, with fans of the classic Star Trek era recognizing what the show was doing and embracing it warmly. The show averaged around 7 to 8 million viewers during its first season, which were strong numbers for a Fox drama in that period. After 2 seasons on Fox, McFarlane moved the show to Hulu, where it premiered its 3rd season in June of 2022 under the new title, The Orville: New Horizons. The move to streaming, like The American Dad move to TBS, turned out to be creatively beneficial. The longer episode runtimes that Hulu permitted allowed the show to develop stories at a pace that network television's 43-minute episode constraint had prevented. The 3rd season received some of the strongest critical notices in the show's history, with individual episodes praised for their thoughtfulness, their emotional complexity, and their genuine ambition. What does the Orville tell us about this lineage? It tells us something important about what happens when a creator has been in the same mode for long enough that they need to get out. McFarlane had spent years making animated comedies that increasingly operated in territory he was publicly uncomfortable with. He had been tied to Fox by contractual obligations and by the enormous financial success of his shows. He had been progressively stepping away from the creative seat on those shows as his other projects demanded attention. And when he finally got the opportunity to build something from scratch on his own terms, what he built was as different from Family Guy as a television series could be while still sharing the same medium. The Orville is in that sense a window into what McFarlane had always wanted to make and had never quite had the freedom or the platform to make until Hulu gave it to him. It is the show that existed on the other side of the animated comedy machine, the thing he was pointing toward whenever he expressed frustration with where his flagship creation had gone. Whether it constitutes a ripoff of anything is an interesting question. It is clearly in conversation with Star Trek's legacy, and it wears that influence openly. But it is also genuinely McFarlane's in a way that his later Family Guy work was not. because it reflects his actual creative priorities rather than the priorities of a writing room he was no longer actively steering. The show has continued to develop. As of early 2025, a fourth season had been discussed, and there was genuine desire among both the creative team and the audience to see it happen. Whether the economics of streaming support that continuation remains to be seen. But the Orville exists as proof that the person who made Family Guy was always more complicated than the show that made him famous. That behind the cutaway gags and the dysfunctional family and the shock humor, there was someone who wanted to tell the kind of stories that talked about hope rather than despair, about what humanity could become, rather than what it had settled for being. That person was always there. It just took 20 years and a different platform for him to get the chance to show it. Section 11. The downstream shows. A full survey of the rest. We have covered the major entries in this lineage. But the history of shows that owe some degree of creative debt to the Family Guy formula does not end with the ones that became culturally significant or instructively disastrous. The full list is considerably longer, and a complete survey requires acknowledging the shows that did not become anything in particular, but that nonetheless tell part of the story. Daria, which aired on MTV from 1997 to 2001, predates Family Guy in an interesting way and represents an alternative path that adult animation could have taken. Not a ripoff, not an imitator, but a show that was occupying adjacent territory with completely different priorities. Daria's protagonist was an adolescent girl who was intelligent, sardonic, and perpetually alienated from a world that valued conformity over substance. The show had no interest in the kind of humor that Family Guy would make its signature. It was quieter, smarter, and more specifically interested in what adolescence actually felt like for certain kinds of teenagers. It ran for 5 seasons and 2 television movies before ending, and it remains one of the most fondly remembered shows in the history of animation on television, even though it is rarely discussed in the same context as the Family Guy lineage. It belongs there, obliquely, as a reminder that adult animation could always have been something other than what the dominant format made it. What is notable about Daria in retrospect is how thoroughly it was excluded from the conversation about what adult animation was supposed to be. The shows that defined the genre's identity in the early 2000s were mostly loud, mostly irreverent, mostly interested in transgression. Daria was none of those things. It was dry and precise and emotionally honest in a way that did not generate the kind of attention that shock comedy generated, and so it was discussed as a cult show, a niche show, a show for a particular kind of viewer, rather than as a central text in the genre's development. That exclusion says something about whose tastes were considered normative and whose were considered particular, and it is a conversation that the genre has been slowly catching, up to in the decades since. Drawn Together, which aired on Comedy Central from 2004 to 2007, was a more directly adjacent show, an animated reality television parody that gathered a cast of animated archetypes in a house and subjected them to show format challenges while making the most offensive jokes its creators could devise. The show had its defenders who appreciated its genuine anarchy and its willingness to demolish any target it could find. It also had its detractors who felt it was noise rather than comedy, offense for its own sake rather than offense in service of a point. It ran for 3 seasons before Comedy Central canceled it. Drawn Together is an interesting case study in the difference between transgression as a comedic strategy and transgression as a comedic goal. Family Guy was transgressive in pursuit of comedy. The offense was meant to produce a laugh. Drawn Together was often transgressive in pursuit of transgression. The goal was to find the most offensive combination of elements possible, and then to note that it had been achieved. When those two different orientations produced similar-looking content, casual viewers could not distinguish between them. But the internal logic of the two approaches was completely different, and the difference showed over time. Shows that treat offense as a means tend to get better as they get more skilled at deploying it. Shows that treat offense as an end tend to escalate beyond the point of comedy because there is no other direction to go. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, both products of the 1960s, are the foundational texts of the animated family comedy in the United States and any discussion of the Family Guy. Lineage that did not acknowledge them would be incomplete. The Flintstones in particular, with its working-class family at a humorous displacement from contemporary suburban America, established the basic template that every animated, family comedy since has worked with or against. Fred Flintstone was a template for Homer Simpson, who was a template for Peter Griffin, who was a template for Stan Smith and Bob Belcher and Frank Murphy and every other animated father who followed in the genre's wake. The lineage is long, and it has deep roots. Futurama, which premiered in 1999, the same year as Family Guy, was created by Matt Groening and deserves mention here because it was in many ways the road not taken. A science fiction animated comedy that shared the Fox Sunday night block with Family Guy for years, Futurama was smarter, more structurally inventive, and more emotionally sophisticated than its time-slot companion. It was canceled by Fox in 2003, revived by Comedy Central in 2008, canceled again in 2013, and then revived again by Hulu in 2023. The most recent Hulu revival has been warmly received and continues to add episodes to a show that has proven remarkably durable. Futurama is not a Family Guy ripoff by any stretch of the definition, but it is part of the same moment in television history, born from the same creative environment occupying the same cultural space, and providing a standing counter-argument to the idea that animated comedy for adults had to operate in the specific register that the Sunday night block made dominant. South Park deserves its own paragraph in this context. Even though it is not in any real sense a Family Guy ripoff, South Park predates Family Guy by 2 years, having premiered on Comedy Central in August of 1997, and it has always occupied a completely different creative tradition. Trey Parker and Matt Stone's approach to animated comedy was always more satirical in intent, more politically pointed in execution, and more willing to take genuine risks with its storytelling than Family Guy at any point in its history. The famous South Park two-parter Cartoon Wars, which aired in 2006 and directly attacked Family Guy's writing style, is worth noting here because it encapsulated a genuine creative disagreement between two competing visions of what animated comedy for adults should be. Parker and Stone believed and articulated publicly that Family Guy's joke structure was lazy, that the cutaway format required no real skill, and that the show's willingness to offend was not the same as the show actually having anything to say. McFarlane disagreed. The argument is ongoing and neither side has definitively won it, but the fact that the argument was made, publicly and in the form of actual television episodes, says something about the stakes that the creative community placed on these questions. It was not just a dispute about rating or market share. It was a dispute about what comedy was for. The Great North, which premiered on Fox in January 2021 and ran for 5 seasons before being canceled in October 2025, was in many ways Bob's Burgers' spiritual sibling. Created by Wendy Molyneux, Lizzie Molyneux-Logelin, and Minty Lewis, the show followed the Tobin family in rural Alaska. A family that was gentle and loving in ways that consciously recalled Bob's Burgers model rather than the Family Guy model. The show featured Nick Offerman as Beef Tobin, a patriarch whose love for his children was enormous and uncomplicated in ways that stood as a quiet counter-argument to the tradition of animated fathers who were mostly sources of chaos. The relationship between Beef and his daughter Judy, voiced by Jenny Slate, was one of the warmest father-daughter relationships in the history of animated television. And the show earned its warm reviews by consistently prioritizing that warmth over easy comedy. Its cancellation in the fall of 2025 was met with genuine sadness by its viewers, and was seen as another example of a network failing to protect something genuinely good. Ripoff, which premiered on Fox in 2023, was created by Dan Harmon, the creator of Community and co-creator of Rick and Morty, and was set in ancient Greece with a cast of gods, monsters, and humans navigating family dynamics in a mythological setting. The show was renewed multiple times, and its second and third seasons demonstrated the kind of improvement that comedies often show when given time to develop. Harmon's writing sensibility, which was always more interested in character dynamics and ensemble relationships than in shock humor, gave Ripoff a different flavor from the Family Guy formula, even while it occupied adjacent territory on the Fox schedule. The show's willingness to find genuine emotion in absurd mythological situations, and to treat its non-human characters with the same depth and consistency that it applied to its human ones, gave it a quality that casual comparison to its time-slot companions did not quite capture. It was doing something specific with the animated family comedy structure that was worth paying attention to. Bob's Burgers spin-off and adjacent content has proliferated in interesting ways. The Bob's Burgers movie, which arrived in May 2022, was a musical feature film that received positive reviews and was later made available on streaming platforms. While its theatrical performance was below expectations, it served as further evidence of the cultural longevity of a show that had become one of Fox's most reliable animated properties. The movie was structured around the question of whether the Belchers would be forced to close their restaurant, which is the same existential question the show has been circling since its first episode, and the way it answered that question, with warmth and music and a genuine respect for the characters and their audience, was characteristic of everything the show has always done well. Universal Basic Guys, which premiered on Fox in September 2024, was renewed for a second season before it had even aired. The show followed two middle-aged men navigating a world in which artificial intelligence has automated their jobs, a premise that was pointed and timely, and that gave the writers plenty of material to work with. Its renewal represented Fox's ongoing commitment to building animated comedy properties that could serve as anchors for a Sunday night block that had lost some of its original pillars. And then there is the matter of the Stewie Griffin spin-off, which was announced by Fox in March of 2026, set for the 2027 to 2028 television season. This will be the next entry in the Family Guy expanded universe, a spin-off centered on the character whose transformation from evil genius to emotional adventurer was one of the most discussed creative decisions in the history of the original show. What that spin-off will do with its subject is a question that does not yet have an answer. Whether it will find a way to give Stewie back the dangerous edge that made him one of television's most original creations, or whether it will continue in the direction of soft Stewie that the original established over its later seasons will determine whether it becomes another entry in the tradition of quality spin-offs or another lesson in what happens when the formula is reproduced without the vision. The lineage continues. The argument continues with it. Section 12. What it all means. The shape of the lineage. We have now spent a considerable amount of time in the company of shows that have, in various ways and to varying degrees, existed in conversation with one particular show that premiered on a Sunday night in January 1999. It is worth pulling back and looking at the shape of what we have described, because the pattern that emerges is genuinely interesting. The first thing the pattern tells you is that the format, the animated family comedy with satirical edge and irreverent humor, is more durable than the specific show that most people associate with it. The Simpsons established the template. Family Guy refined and mutated it. And then dozens of other shows explored what it could become when its elements were reorganized, emphasized differently, or stripped away to reveal what was underneath. The format survived every individual failure. It absorbed every critical verdict. It adapted to every new platform. It will continue to survive and adapt long after the specific shows that defined it in any given era have run their course. The second thing the pattern tells you is about the relationship between heart and humor in this genre. Almost every show that succeeded in this space over the long term did so by maintaining some version of genuine affection for its central characters. Bob's Burgers, American Dad, F is for Family, even Solar Opposites in its quieter moments, these shows kept you watching, not just because they were funny, but because you cared about the people in them. The shows that failed most completely, Alan Gregory, Dads in its worst moments, the later seasons of the original show itself, lost that affection. They became collections of jokes attached to characters rather than stories about characters who generated comedy through who they were and what they wanted. The third thing the pattern tells you is about the economics of television and the way those economics shape creative decisions in ways that are sometimes invisible until they have already done their damage. The Cleveland Show was allowed to produce exactly 88 episodes because that was the syndication threshold. Shows on streaming platforms are canceled not because they have lost their audiences, but because the platform has decided that those audiences are not delivering the value the platform needs. Family Guy continues to exist in 2025, producing episodes that will be seen by a fraction of the audience that watched it at its peak, because animated shows are cheap to produce, and the licensing and streaming rights are enormously profitable. None of these are decisions that have anything to do with whether the shows in question are good. They are decisions that have everything to do with money. That is not a criticism of the people who make those decisions. It is simply a description of the industry in which these shows exist. The fourth thing is perhaps the most important. The shows we admire most in this survey, the ones that we would point to and say, yes, this is what the format is capable of, are all shows that had clear, creative visions. American Dad had Weitzman and Barker's understanding that Stan Smith was most interesting as a man whose certainty was the source of his suffering. Bob's Burgers had Bouchard's conviction that warmth was not a weakness in a comedy, but its strongest possible foundation. F is for Family had Burr's determination to use animation to tell a story that was as honest as any live-action drama about the cost of unexamined anger. Solar Opposites had The Wall, which was a genuinely original idea about what could be hidden inside a show that looked like one thing and turned out to be another. The Orville had McFarlane's Hope, which was something that had been suppressed in his other work for so long that when it finally had room to breathe, it came out with tremendous energy. The shows that failed, by contrast, were mostly shows that had a format but not a vision. They knew what kind of show they were making, but not why they were making it. They had identified the successful elements of their predecessors without asking the question that actually matters. What are we trying to say, and is this the best way to say it? That question is the one that separates the shows worth watching from the shows that exist primarily as data points in a business decision. And it is a question that gets answered not in the pitch meeting, but in the writing room, episode by episode, season by season, by the specific people sitting in those rooms, deciding what their characters want and what they are afraid of, and what they would do in a situation they have never been in before. The shows that answered that question well are the reason the format has survived this long. They proved, each in their own way, that the animated family comedy is not a formula to be repeated. It is a tradition to be engaged with, argued with, added to, and occasionally, When the conditions are right and the people involved care enough, genuinely advanced. That tradition is still being added to. Stewie Griffin is reportedly getting his own spin-off, announced by Fox in March of 2026, which will be the next entry in a lineage that started when Seth MacFarlane pitched a 15-minute pilot to a network executive who took a chance on it and changed Sunday night television in the process. Whatever that spin-off becomes, it will be in conversation with everything we have discussed tonight. It will either learn from what worked or repeat what failed. It will either find its own vision or borrow someone else's formula and hope the formula is enough. The answer to that question will determine whether it is worth watching. The answer always determines that.